It has been 10 years since the first Energy Ethics Conference here in St Andrews, which I remember well, and the last 10 years have underlined that energy research is more important now than ever. The climate crisis demands we work together. The Centre for Energy Ethics here at St Andrews has an interdisciplinary collaborative approach to energy research, which is all about bringing researchers together in a space which encourages asking hard questions, awkward questions, and looking at difficult problems in new ways. It is with this spirit of collaboration and cross and interdisciplinary work in mind that St Andrews, the Centre for Energy Ethics, and indeed the School for Philosophical, Anthropological and Film Studies is delighted to welcome Professor Jessica Smith to give this first inaugural Centre for Energy Ethics lecture. And there really couldn't be anybody more appropriate to do that. Okay, now a bit about Jessica, which... Sorry, right. Now a bit about Jessica, and there's a lot about Jessica when you start to look at it. It's pretty impressive. Jessica M. Smith. Suddenly you start being called Jessica M. Smith. I don't know what that shift denotes. Oh, okay. Is that what it is? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Jessica M. Smith is an anthropologist and STS scholar who explores the societal dimensions of energy and natural resource production. She has championed the importance of humanities and social science research in spaces commonly dominated by STEM subjects. With the support of an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, she is completing a book on political polarization and the energy transition in the American West. Are we allowed to mention the working title? Coal Afterlives, : that colon, yeah. Professor Jessica Smith was named a Kavli Fellow by the National Academy of Sciences in 2022 and held a British Academy International Visiting Fellowship here at the University of St Andrews back in 2018, which was great for us. She is the author of 2 books and more than 70 peer-reviewed publications in anthropology, science and technology studies, environmental social science, and engineering education journals. Jessica's research has also been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and the US Department of Energy. She is currently serving as editor-in-chief of the journal Engineering Studies and as a member of the US National Academy's commitment on geological and geotechnical engineering. Jessica is co-director of the Center for Ethnography, which I'm guessing makes more sense in the context of where you work than it would in an anthropology department. Yeah, she is a co-director of the Center for Ethnography and professor in the Department of Engineering, Design and Society at the Colorado School of Mines. So, Jessica, welcome. Really looking forward to your talk. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam, for the introduction. Thank you, Meta, for our collaboration, and thank you to Meta's entire team. It's a delight to be back here. And I'm so grateful that you came back after the reception. I hope for some rowdy questions 45 minutes from now. So I am from a hyper energy intensive place. Excellent, thank you. Gillette, Wyoming calls itself the energy capital of the nation. We've been the largest producer of coal in the United States for the past 4 decades. At the industry's peak in 2008, roughly 5,000 workers at our 12 surface mines provided electricity to approximately 85 million other people in more than 40 states. While overall production numbers have halved since 2008, the largest 2 mines still produce more coal each year than all mines in all states east of the Mississippi River, including the industry's historic stronghold in Appalachia. They're so large and eat through so much prairie that satellites track their movements from space. I was one of those workers during summer breaks from college when I would come home and drive haul trucks or work in the processing plant. As the coal market continues to slide, other energy developments feel increasingly urgent. South of town, the main highway is now flanked by fields of towering wind turbines. Oil, gas, and coal bed methane infrastructure appear every few miles, and long, perfectly parallel breaks in the sagebrush disclose where the ground has been dug to make way for pipelines. It's more difficult to discern the web of new uranium mines that is growing in anticipation of a nuclear renaissance. A company called Cowboy Clean Fuels is using old coal bed methane wells to inject sugar beet byproducts into underground coal formations, where the sugar beet molasses sets off a chemical reaction that pushes methane to the surface while sequestering CO2 in the coal. They market this methane as renewable natural gas. North of town sit our experiments in trying to find second lives for coal. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is one effort. The Wyoming Integrated Test Center provides space for companies to test their technologies using real flue gas from the adjacent Dry Fork Power Plant, which was one of the last coal-fired stations to be built in the US and currently the only one that currently provides electricity at a cost that is equal to what it would cost at a wind or solar farm. Otherwise, coal is more expensive. A few miles down the highway, the Wyoming Innovation Center rises from the relics of a bankrupted mine. It's home to experiments finding other marketable uses for coal besides burning it, like manufacturing activated carbon filtration devices and extracting rare earths and critical minerals. East of town, our power plant is experimenting with turning coal into hydrogen. And at the lot next door, where we were originally going to build a coal gasification plant, there are plans to build a nuclear fuel fabrication facility. It's a lot. I spent the first part of my career studying the history and contours of Gillette residents' generally positive feelings about the coal industry and the social worlds that they built from it. My first book traced how gender was made and unmade at the mines, with crews crafting more gender-neutral subject positions that facilitated the integration of women into the industry. As the years passed, I watched from afar as everything I had lived and studied seemed to fall apart. The coal market imploded. There were layoffs, there were lockouts, and people rallied around Trump as their defender. I returned home for my current book project to investigate how people in Gillette were grappling with the coal downturn and compare their experiences with my other field site in Pueblo, which is a city that burns our coal and is home to what will be the last coal-fired power plant to go offline in Colorado. During my fieldwork in Gillette, I couldn't avoid driving past an intersection with a giant V-shaped homemade sign adorned with an American flag fluttering in the wind. One side had originally been painted to say Trump 2020, but someone had made the effort to paint 2024 on top of it. It was a durable sign. The other side said FJB. I will let you figure out what that means. I thought about the maintenance it must have taken to keep the sign brightly painted despite the harsh summer sun and winter blizzards. When I came home, I expected to find lockstep support for Trump, who boisterously campaigned on promises of reinvigorating the country's coal industry. Gillette itself has always been one of the most conservative areas of one of the most conservative states. In each of Trump's last 3 elections, we gave him some of his widest margins in the entire country, so 9 out of 10 votes. And Wyoming itself gave Trump his widest margins at a state level. We boast about having the largest number of registered Republicans in the country at 77%, which outpaces Idaho at 61, Oklahoma and Utah at 53, and South Dakota and Nebraska at 50. What I found actually talking with people, however, surprised me. It also challenges what has become a taken for granted story about coal and conservative politics, about fossil fuels and fascism. And it underscores the increasing urgency of Metas and my call 10 years ago to take a more capacious approach to understanding energy ethics. After Trump's upset victory in 2016, journalists placed the blame squarely on rural voters who had been duped into voting against their own interests. They equated Trump country with coal country, a place mired by bigotry, nostalgia, and resentment. Energy imaginaries featured prominently in Kevin Baker's critiques in The New Republic. He advocated for blue states to financially detach themselves from red ones, which would allow them to do things like build new high-speed rail systems that would run past state-of-the-art wind farms, as well as highways that recharge self-driving cars. The red states could keep their coal. News outlets showcased the racism, drug addiction, abuse, multi-generational poverty, and gun-toting fatalism in Appalachia, which has long featured as America's own other. The New Yorker, in its glowing review of now Vice President J.D. Vance's hillbilly elegy, non-ironically asked, why is the hillbilly culture so defensive, insular, and frozen in time? Few journalists and pundits accounted for the fact that it was not just white, rural, working-class people who sent Trump to the White House. He wouldn't have won without also carrying suburban residents and white college-educated men. In the wake of the election, academics built up a much larger argument about white rural people presenting a unique threat to democracy, with their alleged greater propensity to hold racist and xenophobic beliefs, to believe in conspiracy theories, to accept violence as a legitimate course of political action, and to exhibit anti-democratic tendencies. Sociologists were swift to point out the inaccuracies in how these authors represented and drew from their research, but not before it topped the New York Times bestsellers list. Others have theorized the so-called links between fossil fuels, fascism, and white supremacy. Kara Daggett's notion of petromasculinity links fossil fuel consumption, climate change denial, and the defense of white patriarchal authority. It interprets displays of hypermasculinity as violent compensation for the anxieties generated by threats to traditional gender orders and fossil-fueled forms of life. Malm and the Zetkin Collective argue that fossil-fueled technologies were historically born alongside European nationalism and colonialism, providing early fascists with a way to assert domination over nature and people, and in the process, wrap up coal and oil with not just white identity, but white supremacy. In contrast, they posit renewables can promote more democratic ideals because they are flows rather than stocks. Both accounts elucidate important dimensions of how political leaders like Trump, fossil fuel trade groups, and extremist movements weaponize certain forms of white masculinity, authoritarian politics, and fossil fuels. Yet they also create seductive binaries that assure people who espouse particular politics that not only are fossil fuels bad, so are the life worlds they created. These are precisely the kind of binaries that Mehta and I critiqued in our original formulation of energy ethics. While they may not have intended to do so, these sorts of ethical equations have bled into how academics perceive the people who inhabit fossil fuel production systems. I regularly hear scholars recognized for excellence in social analysis make statements that the left ought to give up on white working people because they remain stuck in the past, because they refuse to leave the places they are from, because they are hopelessly bigoted, as though racism doesn't exist among the college-educated, as if an anthropologist wouldn't resent being told to retrain to become a chemist, as if we ourselves wouldn't mourn being forced to leave the places we live with our families. After presenting the outline of my current book project at one workshop, I concluded with a question about what we owed each other as producers and consumers of electricity. A fellow scholar self-righteously declared that she ought not to care about the plight of people who wished her dead. I blinked. At no point had I shared such an observation because her assumptions about my interlocutors were untrue. All she needed to know to be confident in her judgment was that they were white, blue-collar people in a county where the majority of people voted for Trump. A few minutes later, she began her presentation by stating her desire to break down dehumanizing portrayals of people that fed political polarization. Non-ironically, I am reminded of trenchant observations that rural and working class folks are the last groups of people that are socially acceptable to mock in public. What I offer here is not a defense of certain forms of white working class masculinity, but an invitation to consider the broader representational economy that allows some theories, some images, and some assumptions about politics to circulate more readily than others. Arlie Hochschild provides a more nuanced account of appeals of Trump in places like Kentucky. She argues that people in red states hold more tightly to ideologies of rugged individualism that blame people themselves for not attaining the American dream, rather than the social structures that provide the grounds for opportunity. Trump garners their support in a carefully coordinated four-step anti-shame ritual that we fall for every time. This matters for how we think about fossil fuels and white supremacy. Rather than arguing that conservative voters are necessarily white Christian nationalists, she documents how white nationalist groups tried but ultimately failed to exploit the emotional vulnerabilities of the Kentucky coal county where she did her fieldwork. There are elements of Hochschild's theory that hold true for Gillette. People there strongly felt that the Democrats' attacks on the coal industry failed to distinguish between the CEOs running the companies and the miners themselves. As one local economic development leader explained to me, it's one thing to have an agenda, and it's another to alienate a community because of what they do. He continued, coal built the United States and brought us to where we are, but then it got turned into a four-letter word through a lot of politics. All of a sudden, these hardworking people who had been providing power to everybody were turned into these people that were doing something bad. Trump, in contrast, upheld their strongly felt senses of provision and offered them empathy, even if they also recognized him as being ultimately unsuccessful in reviving the industry. The surprising part of my return, however, was actually the lack of support I found for Trump and his administration. There were the few true believers who delighted in his anti-elitist antics, and many of them were on this 4th of July float, but they were outnumbered. Almost everyone I met was worried, even lifelong Republicans. One young woman in a coffee shop said that she tried to stay out of politics because it stressed her out too much. She hoped his actions were the political equivalent of spring cleaning. She said, quote, "Everything seems like it's chaos and it's a mess and Trump's just flying off the handle and making erratic decisions. But I think there's a purpose behind what he's doing, and I just hope it's for our benefit. Reducing corruption, restoring the economy so that everyone's children can be successful in the future." I also found that people were worried about polarization. I heard stories about neighbors who used to take daily walks together no longer speaking to each other, not because one was a Democrat and one was a Republican, but because they were different versions of Republicans. In 2024, the Wyoming State Legislature was the first to be entirely taken over by the ultra-conservative National Freedom Caucus, and they mounted a hardline platform. Reduce government spending, defund public schools and our only four-year university. Reduce taxes in a place that already has the country's lowest. Discourage undocumented immigration, unravel DEI protections. Many of its leaders and members came from northeastern Wyoming. In a hushed voice in a discreet back booth at a restaurant, an old friend told me she no longer knew how to identify herself because she was so disgusted with state as well as national politics. Yet while most of the people I met were critical of Trump and the divisiveness he was sowing, people hesitated to share those criticisms publicly. A friend said that even remotely saying something barely against Trump would garner accusations of being a Kamala Harris follower. Quote, "You can't be out and despise him. It has to be something you kind of keep to yourself." While having dinner with another old acquaintance, he shared his worries that Trump had gone off the rails and was taking the country with him. But then he added, quote, "At least he's better than Kamala. She's terrible and would have really destroyed things." He stopped pointedly and held my gaze with one raised eyebrow, perhaps daring me to out myself as a Democrat. I was out as a Democrat. I agreed that her policies would have dealt another economic blow to Gillette. The second surprise of my return home was discovering how strongly people criticized the coal companies themselves. In the Gillette I grew up in, coal jobs were so prized that it was almost impossible to get hired on full-time without a personal connection. People stayed until they retired. Miners earned more than anywhere else in the country, which was a legacy of the coal companies' bids to discourage them from unionizing back in the 70s and 80s. When they worked overtime, hourly employees without a college education made more than their managers. We lived in the same neighborhoods, went to the same schools, and played on the same sports teams as the kids of doctors and lawyers.
You too.
The dominant story that people told about our town was that we used coal to turn a raucous 1960s oil boom town into a good place to live and raise a family. It was the coal industry that provided people stable, family-supporting jobs. It was the coal industry that provided a tax base that allowed small-town Gillette to enjoy public services and amenities that would normally be reserved for people in a large city. My junior high had a state-of-the-art planetarium. Entire grades were bused to learn to swim in our school district Olympic-sized pool, and we spent our summers riding bikes on paths connecting dozens of parks, the Free City Pool, softball and soccer fields, and the enormous outdoor water slide at our county recreation center. The county also covered the cost of all of our school activities. These government investments in social infrastructure led to people joking that we were either the most conservative socialist government or the most socialist conservative government in the entire country. A man who had lived through the oil boom expressed a common frustration when people in town criticized coal. Sitting in a cafe adjacent to the railroad tracks, he said, "We're all in the coal business. Coal is paid for our roads, our schools, our nice facilities." Last summer, however, criticisms of the companies cutting back on wages and benefits rushed into conversations like water breaching a failing dam. No more generous insurance plans, no more safety bonuses, no more summer picnics and Christmas parties, no more buses to work, no more company t-shirts, hats, and belt buckles to mark accomplishments, No more summer student program like the one I participated in. More than one company had brought in extra managers to catch hourly workers committing infractions, providing grounds to fire them without entitlement to unemployment benefits. People kept using the word corporate to capture their critique. The wife of a longtime equipment operator told me, "It's hard to get past that corporate feel when it used to be more of a community feel." Her husband kept his mine job only to bankroll their family's multi-generational sheep and cattle ranch. She continued, saying, "There's a lot of corporate people in St. Louis that are overseeing the mine site. Then there's a lot of bosses. There's probably at least 10 bosses above my husband, and he's a dirt boss. There's just a lot of uppers that have their hands in a lot of things." Even the white-collar employees I met were critical. One retired local company executive mourned how the parent companies headquartered in other parts of the country no longer invested in community development. He said, "Now their interest is corporate because the mines have been bought and sold so many times. Everything is corporate, and before it was more local." Last summer, for the first time, I met legions of people who had willingly and happily left their mine jobs before they reached retirement. I met former mine employees who worked for the vendors that the mines hired for specialized work. Others had left the industry entirely. Some became real estate agents. Some ran their own businesses. Rick seemed at home in the barbecue restaurant he built after leaving a 3-decade run as an equipment operator. He wore a gray horseshoe mustache, a baseball hat, a concert t-shirt, and blue jeans. The walls were covered with boar heads, animal pelts, a glass-encased hunting knife collection, and a plate signed by the band members of ZZ Top when they were stopping in Gillette on their way for a meal, presumably on their way to or from the wild annual Sturgis motorcycle rally held 2 hours east on Interstate 90. Rick's stories made clear that the employees' frustrations with the mining companies hadn't started with the 2019 lockout or even the 2016 mass layoffs, which had taken place only weeks after Hillary Clinton infamously promised to put a lot of coal miners out of work. He spoke colorfully but prefaced his comments carefully, saying that he didn't want to diss mining because of what it allowed him to provide for his family. The stability was important to him, given the precarity he experienced as a kid growing up on a poor ranch with divorced parents. His first big break was working at a uranium mine south of town in the late 1970s. When the oil company that owned it decided to close it, the managers transferred them all up to one of the coal mines that same oil company had just opened. He laughed gleefully, saying, "In my day, it was the loaves and fishes. Alleluia, man. I got me a freaking coal mine job." With the oil companies in charge, they had 100% medical and 100% dental coverage. He continued saying, "I had checks I hadn't cashed yet. They were constantly giving you money, 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 money." In Rick's view, that generosity stopped in the 1990s when the, quote, greedy and unappreciative coal companies that had bought the mines started prioritizing stockholders and left, quote, the poor guy that's doing it all to rot. As the price of coal fell, the overall survival strategy seemed to become pushing employees to produce more while offering them less. He said, "We went from an 8-hour shift to a 12-hour shift. We went from 4 to 5 days a week to 7 days a week. God, you didn't know if you were coming or going. You just knew if you had to be at work tomorrow. The fluctuation, 3 days, 1 off, work 3 nights, get 2 off, work 7 days, get 7 off. It really takes a toll on the body. I see these people that have been doing it longer than I have, and they're just wore the hell out. Even though it's not manual labor and sledgehammers and freaking pickaxes doing this shit anymore, hours and the time take its toll. The nights are long and you get to where your family life is just in the shitter. You get a ton of divorces. It's not very conducive to living a good life. The money is good, but the money became worse and worse." At that point, he said, coal jobs became less desirable since people could get a job in town that paid the same but didn't require a 3-hour commute or shift work. Rick never looked back. He said, "My soul was getting sucked out from the mining industry. Absolutely, my soul was getting sucked out." Rick's stories and critiques of the coal companies and their shareholders point to the anti-elitism and populism that was brewing in places like Gillette well before Trump started eyeing the presidency. It was stemming from the social contract that had once governed corporate community relationships being reduced to tatters. The social fabric tying people in Gillette to one another, despite their differences, has also frayed. This was a second source of not just the anti-elitism, but the rise in conspiracy thinking that bubbled in the collective ether. A series of contentious debates spurred by a very small group of very vocal people ended friendships, set neighbors against each other, and generated a lingering sense of unease. In 2020, a Facebook scandal resulted in the resignation of a city councilman and a counter movement to reinstate him and fire the mayor and a sympathetic local judge. A former football player from my very own high school encouraged his followers to tar and feather the mayor, who was the first female to serve Gillette in its 130-year history. And he entered a float in the 4th of July parade that enacted her standing in a jail. Trouble with the public library soon followed. Outrage over a Pride Month social media post. Protests against a magic performance by a person who turned out to be transgender. Calls to remove or relocate LGBTQ+ books from the children's section. The firing of the library director when she only reshelved some of them. A friend who is serving on the library board described the personal toll of being attacked and called a pedophile and a groomer by the same small group of agitators every week. She stopped walking alone back to her car at night, and her husband installed security lights on their home. Gillette used to be a place where people didn't lock their doors. Shortly after my return last summer, the city council voted to stop providing funds to a health clinic that offered low-cost reproductive care and birth control. The current mayor, the formerly disgraced city councilman, joined a group of ministers and a Freedom Caucus politician in falsely accusing the clinic of offering or encouraging abortions. After an outpouring of public support, funds were reinstated a few weeks later. The all-male county commission then voted 3-2 to eliminate their financial support for the clinic. When I was in Gillette, my best friend from high school and her wife came to visit. We walked together downtown, shopping at the new small businesses that were making a stand against the giant Walmart. They held hands at a crosswalk. When we returned to their Subaru, we found something in the shape of a business card wedged in one of the windows. One side had an illustration of Jesus atop a white horse, splattered in blood, in a red river littered with bodies. His eyes glowed, as did the sword he held high in the air. Tanks and fires filled the horizon. The back instructed the reader, non-ironically in rainbow font, that Jesus was not only kind, accepting, forgiving, and nice, but brings wrath, anger, and judgment, and sends sinners to hell for lying, drunkenness, stealing, fornication, drug use, greed, homosexuality, lust, covetousness, selfishness, hatred, etc. Sinners were said to be the enemy of God and must repent or perish.org. A few weeks later, the city council revoked our town's hate crime ordinance. When I visited people in their homes, Fox News was usually playing on the television. People consumed the rest of their news from online sources, Facebook, YouTube, podcasts, and an online news platform called the Cowboy State Daily, which is owned by our state's largest Republican campaign donor. Only the most loyal still subscribe to our local paper, the Gillette News Record. When I worked there in high school, we published 6 issues a week. It was down to 2, with reporters stretched so thin that they couldn't afford to have one of them regularly attend the city council and county commission meetings. One of them told me that he showed up to cover a high school football game and some people yelled fake news at him. Other institutions that used to knit the town together were also faltering. Gillette used to be a town where almost everybody belonged to a church. Attendance was straggling at what people called the mainstream churches, while chairs and pews filled every week at the town's multiple non-denominational ones. The minister at one of the older churches told me that he stopped affiliating with the local ministerial association because its leaders, from the evangelical ones, encouraged everyone to tell their congregations how to vote. One of our state representatives was the daughter of an evangelical minister, and the ministers were a frequent presence at our government meetings. Family friends attended one of these new churches. Sitting in their backyard, they characterized Gillette as a town rich in spirit with wisdom and knowledge. There are a lot of predictions that the revival on the spiritual side is going to be here, the wife said to me, before describing her own spiritual growth. I asked about the tone of public life in Gillette. She and her husband shook their heads and shared their worries about the increasing political polarization they saw both locally and nationally. She described it as, quote, a real dividing, and then explained, you're either against it or you're on that side or the other. And they feel really strong about what they think, and we feel really strong about what we think. And it seems like we can't come together very well. That kind of binary thinking was difficult to escape even for her. A few minutes later, when describing this particularly nasty period of local politics, she diagnosed it as a spiritual problem pitting good against evil, good against evil. As their grandchildren chased each other in the backyard, they said that they would stay in Gillette. He liked living in a country town where people wore cowboy boots and hats, and she emphasized what Gillette offered for children and families. I asked them what they thought about the coal industry's future, anticipating that they would have a lot to say. His coal job had supported their family as well as the public services they appreciated. They did not have a lot to say. In the same calm tone that made him famous amongst the hot tempers at the mine, he predicted that Jesus would return to rapture the faithful before the end of coal. I paused, trying to ascertain if he was joking, but he was not. The great financial reset was coming, he continued, and started telling me about the Bitcoin mine on the south side of town and the nearby $200 million health clinic that had been founded by a Bitcoin baron and was engaging in futuristic medical experiments. In addition to this reset, he continued, natural disasters were about to bring about a great awakening that would send people back to the church in time for the rapture. She laughed nervously, caught my eyes, and tried to change the subject, saying that I probably was not interested in all of his conspiracy theories. He said he had nothing to be embarrassed about. Neither of them seemed worried about either the end of coal or the world as we knew it, safe in the status of their own souls. They were preparing for more momentous revolutions than the energy transition. Dominant accounts of the political repercussions of the coal downturn trade in glib portraits of coal country conservatives who gleefully and ignorantly support both Trump and the coal companies against their better interest. Besides being offensive, these dominant accounts miss at least two crucial insights. The first is that people in Gillette wanted to protect the coal industry's right to exist, but they did not blindly trust or support the coal companies themselves. In fact, they were stridently critical of them and easily identified when their interests diverged. Everyone hoped for some sort of diversification. Second, coal was not inherently linked with the alt-right. In Wyoming, support for coal and its additional taxation spanned party lines. In 1969, it was Republican Governor Stan Hathaway who persuaded the state to pass an additional 1% severance tax to create a permanent mineral trust fund. This was an idea first proposed by his Democratic opponent in the prior election. It was also Democrat Ed Herschler, Wyoming's only three-term governor, who steered the state through the 1970s coal boom. And lastly, it was Democrat Dave Friedenthal, one of the state's most popular governors, who presided over the massive expansion of coal production in the Powder River Basin over 2 terms in the early 2000s. Even at the depths of the coal downturn, not all Trump voters were Trump supporters. Deep disaffection with the Republican Party and its most conservative caucus was stirring in one of the reddest counties in the reddest state in the country. The National Democratic Party's own elitism, climate policies, and ineffective just transition programs made voting for them a traitorous act, leaving people few alternatives besides throwing up their hands and checking out completely. I did find populist impulses, but they had their origins beyond some purported rural rage. The erosion of the social contract, and the fraying of the institutions that used to bind people together. But what of whiteness, white supremacy, and white Christian nationalism, a key plank in arguments that tie coal with conservatism, fossil fuels with fascism? It matters in Gillette, where 90% of people identify as white. As Christine Wally writes, one form of white privilege was being able to vote for Trump without having to fear the bigotry his campaign was unleashing. It also matters that primarily white families in Gillette benefited from the industry without having to experience its most harmful environmental impacts. The majority of coal-fired power plants that burned our coal were built in communities of color, like Pueblo, the second field site in my book. But whiteness also matters in deeper ways that ought to give us pause as the next wave of industrial energy infrastructure fans out across the rural U.S. In Gillette, ranchers have come to serve as the moral counterpoint to mining, oil and gas, and other large-scale energy development. Not many of them talk on the public record, but those who do are affiliated with the Powder River Basin Natural Resource Council, which is the only grassroots environmental group in Wyoming willing to take on the coal industry. They primarily represent multi-generational ranching families like the Turners. LJ and his wife Karen live on his family's Turner Crest Ranch, which was originally homesteaded by his grandparents in 1918. By the time he became a father raising his own children, 3 mines had reached within 20 miles of their land. 2 of them were the largest in the entire country. In LJ's lifetime, he watched the springs and creeks dry up. Standing beside a dry creek where he used to hunt rabbits, he said, "There was willows and rose bushes and all this kind of brush along here. We'd have beaver, mink, different things like that, sometimes some pheasants. Now it's just, it ain't there no more. And whenever we had water in the place, frogs were absolutely thick. And now I don't know that we have a frog on the place." The Turner Crest Ranch is no stranger to mineral development. LJ once found a marker for an 1890 placer oil claim, and his father worked at the infamous Teapot Dome oil reserve in the 1920s to keep the ranch afloat. In the 1960s, LJ himself once worked at a nearby uranium mine until they went broke. He said, quote, "The history of the uranium mines is the reason I'm cautious about endorsing coal. Because whenever the uranium miners quit, and they just walked away and left everything as can be seen today." Sometimes LJ was diplomatic in his public comments. Standing by the dry creek that day, he said, "I hate to be too critical of the industry because it helped us make a living. It also helped several hundred other families make a living too. But if water's limited, we're probably going to have a lot of regret." Other times he was more blunt, such as when he wrote a letter to the editor saying that coal should be left to die like the dinosaurs. Letters in response were swift, arguing that it'd be tantamount to allowing Gillette to die. Ranchers like LJ and Karen invite us to remember that there was a Gillette before oil, gas, and coal. But holding up ranchers as the moral conscience of mining fails to account for the settler colonial histories of ranching itself. Most people who call themselves original homesteaders, like the Turners, staked their claims in 1917 or 1918, after the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916 made it easier for settlers to claim large tracts of arid land that were more promising for raising livestock than farming, like in the East. But before the rich grasslands of the Powder River Basin fattened white ranchers' livestock, they were prized hunting grounds for the Crow, the Lakota, and then the Cheyenne. They were so vital that they remained unceded Indian territory in the earliest treaties with the U.S. government. The first ranches carved out from those native lands was done by the cattle baron Elias Whitcomb, who created a family that embodied both the fluidity of social life on the 19th century Great Plains, as well as the efforts to discipline it. Whitcomb was one of the first men to drive cattle into Wyoming in the 1860s during the open range era. While living as one of the first white settlers, he married Kate Shaw, whose mother was Oglala Lakota and whose father was an English boat captain and licensed Indian trader. When Elias and Kate moved up to Cheyenne, she reportedly kept a teepee in the front lawn of their mansion on Cattle Barons Row. But Elias is also said to have told Kate that she and their 3 surviving daughters could either learn to dress and act as white women or take some of his ponies and return to their people, who were being moved onto reservations like Pine Ridge. They decided to go to finishing school in Boston and then return to Wyoming. Arrowheads and teepee rings still scatter throughout the region's gullies and ridges. Ranching families collect these as well as military souvenirs waged by our federal government against Native nations. During one fieldwork trip, I stayed at a ranch the family called Pashasha, which they claimed was the Lakota word for Red Hill, in honor of the time a previous generation leased land from the Lakota at Pine Ridge. Descendants of another homesteader were told that their grandfather purchased their land at $5 an acre from a Sioux Indian. It's more difficult to talk about the violence that was waged here, especially at a place called Lightning Creek. A few miles away from the largest coal mine in the world sits an unmarked ambush site that local historians describe as the last battle of the Ogallala. It is deep in the Powder River Basin grasslands, where the northwest wind blows so strongly and reliably that most of the cottonwood trees grow with a permanent bend. On October 31st, 1903, Sheriff William Miller and a posse of ranchers waited atop a ridge that looked down at the cottonwoods surrounding Lightning Creek. There had been complaints that Lakota from Pine Ridge were continuing to hunt wild game and then steal livestock when game was scarce. The U.S. Supreme Court had sided with the ranchers, ruling in 1896 that the laws of the new state of Wyoming overrode native treaty-based hunting rights. When a group of Lakota who were returning to Pine Ridge arrived to the site, Sheriff Miller and his men opened fire from atop the ridge, immediately killing an 11-year-old boy and his horse. Ogallala took cover behind a tree that looked like an undulating serpent. The main trunk had doubled over and turned to the ground, touching it before once again growing upwards. 4 more Ogallala perished, along with Sheriff Miller and one of his deputies. 9 were arrested for illegal hunting without evidence, but the charges were dropped on a technicality. No one was ever charged for the deaths of the Lakota. 3 decades later, in 1935, 4 men who had been boys during the attack returned to the site, asking permission from the ranch owner to exhume the bodies of the 4 adults who were buried there so they could return them to Pine Ridge. They immediately walked to the serpent-shaped tree. From there, they walked northeast, counting each step until they reached a horse corral, and they immediately found the burial site on their first try. More than a century later, the serpent-shaped tree still stands, a silent witness to the violence that took place there. Give me just 1 minute. So people kept telling me that I had to go visit the new Bitcoin mine south of town. I drove past the Trump sign with its fluttering American flags. I drove past 2 evangelical churches. On the right-hand side, a series of black signs began appearing at regular intervals, interspersed among the hay bales and snow fences. They were painted by hand with ominous injunctions. Trust Jesus. God's knocking. Turn to Jesus. Follow Jesus. Cry out to Jesus. Seek Jesus. Please repent. I slowed down once I saw a set of large, nondescript, silver corrugated metal buildings that people had told me were the cryptocurrency mine. I parked on the gravel road and walked up to the chain link fence surrounding them. The buildings hummed in a continuous pitch that was audible even above the noise of the vehicles speeding past us on the highway. The sign identified it as the Bone Pile Bitcoin Mine, and the owner is Saber 56, a company whose X feed was empty and whose website was non-functional when I tried to look them up. An internet search later informed me that the site was named after the adjacent Bone Pile electricity substation, which was owned by the owners of the Dry Fork Power Plant, the one north of town that hosts our CCUS testbed. It was taking advantage of the excess capacity on the grid resulting from the downturn in coal production. Because the mines were producing less coal, they required less electricity to run the giant shovels and drag lines. There was no one else there, aside from a larger-than-life human skeleton leaning against a broken-down old piece of ranch equipment. It felt eerie. The human emptiness of the site contrasted sharply with the actual mines I remembered as hubs of human activity and employment, even when they relied on large and even automated equipment. Turning around and driving back toward Gillette, I discovered that the religious signs had less menacing messages spray painted on the other side. Jesus loves, Jesus forgives, accept Jesus, shine Jesus, come Jesus, life in Jesus. I drove to our museum to ask a friend what he knew about the Bitcoin mine. It turned out that the eeriness had deeper roots. 150 years ago, it was a battle site. By 1865, the Powder River Basin was a tinderbox. Bozeman had forged a trail to Montana's gold fields along the western side of the Powder River Basin, directly violating the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. In response to that incursion and the Sand Creek Massacre 500 miles south, Cheyenne, Lakota, and Arapaho had raided military outposts. In retaliation, the U.S. Army mounted an expedition with instructions to, quote, make vigorous war upon the Indians and punish them so that they will be forced to keep the peace. Separately, investors from Iowa were pushing to establish a separate route to Montana that would avoid the Bozeman Trail entirely. Sawyers led roughly 200 civilian men and 150 soldiers with 80 wagons to establish a route along the eastern side, also in direct violation of the treaty. By August 9th, they made camp close to the Pumpkin Buttes along Caballo Creek, where Sawyer described seeing, quote, large quantities of first-rate bituminous coal. I should think it almost inexhaustible. A few days later, thirsty and beleaguered by incessant 90-degree heat, a 19-year-old civilian teamster went a few miles ahead and found water at what would eventually be called Bone Pile Creek, in honor of his bones. A group of Cheyenne found and killed him and then attacked the larger contingent, apparently making particular efforts to run off the livestock. They buried hedges in a makeshift coffin made of wood from their wagons, assembled them in a circle, and dug pits. After a few days of fighting, they retreated back to Caballo Creek, where they dug more rifle pits and set up two 12-pound mountain howitzers to contend with the growing numbers of Cheyenne. By the time it was over, 2 soldiers had perished. Neither site is marked today, though you can still see the divots of the rifle pit at the Bone Pile site, which is now private land a few steps away from the Bitcoin mine. The other site no longer exists. This is what it looks like now. This is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. One of the mines was seeking an expansion and conducted an environmental survey that ended up identifying the pits at Caballo Creek. They donated all of the artifacts to the Rockpile Museum, but the land itself was mined through and then reclaimed. It looks like generic grassland, but it's not the same dirt, hills, or vegetation, and the archaeological site is obviously gone. I drove back to the Bone Pile site to revisit it, knowing its deeper history. Surrounded by the buzz of late summer insects and the crypto mine, I felt lost in my town's own history, reminded that we can't reckon with those we don't know. It reminded me that we need to grapple with the potential links between fossil fuels and white supremacy in this longer historical frame. I encourage us to think with Ann Stoller's notion of recursive histories, not just the purported bigotry of working class whites. Recursive histories point to the uneven, ongoing ways that the past continues to inhabit, shape, and violate the present. Colonial and imperial power operates through constant reinscription, modified practices, and active ruination that form the grounds for modern inequalities, such as those being rolled out as part of the energy transition. I looked at the landscape surrounding me with its dozens of energy experiments popping up amongst the sagebrush, the wind farms, the carbon capture facilities, the sugar beet CO2 sequestration, oil and gas, coal bed methane, solar panels, uranium, nuclear fuel, the critical minerals lab, and the coal products test bed. They're each being literally built from the grounds of that longer history, though it remains unevenly recognized and therefore unevenly grappled with. In thinking about Gillette and places like it, the point is not that petromasculinity or proto-fascism don't exist. They do, and we ought to be vigilant. One of my invitations is to consider the larger political economy of imagery and accounts of rural conservatives. People with particular political predilections are more likely to gobble up images, like the one on the left, that underscore our own sense of superiority than the one on the right. They are also coal miners, and our monolithic treatment of coal communities erodes any common ground we could find to chart pathways forward. I am reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois's trenchant observation that the animosity of white workers towards Blacks was grounded primarily in racialized labor market competition. I am reminded of David Roedinger's key insight that racism among working class whites is not an unexplained or otherwise uncaused disposition. The psychological superiority that it bestows on whites functions as a wage that compensates for poor pay. I find Kate Dudley's account of precarity's affects more compelling than theories that attribute authoritarianism uniquely to fossil fuels or that flatten the emotional lives of rural working people to rage, anger, or anxiety. In her prescient study of the closure of a Midwestern auto factory, she showed how the transition from a manufacturing to a service economy was centrally about the cultural meaning of their work and the value of their contribution to society. Perhaps I have too deep of emotional investments in having seen people without a college degree experience relatively unalienated labor, buy homes, and send their kids to college. Perhaps the utility-scale wind and solar projects that are gobbling up land across Wyoming and Colorado have made me too skeptical of the supposedly unique liberatory potential of renewable energy. Perhaps I have seen that our residents who are most likely to be white Christian nationalists are powering their communes with solar energy. Perhaps I know too many coal miners who are Democrats, too many who are Republicans and critical of Trump, too many who cringe when he drags out men in hard hats to prop up his political stagecraft, too many who engage in their own politics of care. But I appreciate her argument that what is operating through regimes of whiteness, masculinity, and heteronormativity are politics of dispossession that deny particular sorts of people a claim on the future. To me, it seems awfully convenient that caricatures of Trump country, of baskets of deplorables, of coal towns that merit being abandoned and left to ruin, rose to prominence just as the mainstream US left embraced climate policy without clear paths forward for what they envisioned as a just transition. It remains elusive. Was the Wyoming miners' desire to save the coal industry nostalgic? Yes, but for what? Not just for a white supremacist heteropatriarchy, but for a deep feeling that their labor mattered. It mattered to the companies employing them and to a country that depended on their labor for electricity. Is the sense of provisioning that they enunciate paternalistic? Yes, but it is also a counter-narrative to a world that devalues work with the hands, viewing it as rote and replaceable. Dudley calls this the culture of the mind, and Joan Williams shows how heartily it was embraced by Obama, who more than any other president invoked smartness as the key to the future. It was not just his coal policies that were alienating. The problem, I think, is that we equate Trump's rhetoric and fossil fuel corporations' messaging with how blue-collar workers themselves actually think and feel. In 2017, when ABC News came to Gillette to chronicle our reaction to the election, Stacey Moeller, a rare coal miner who is also an out-of-the-closet Democrat, explained how even she stopped voting for them after Hillary's tone-deaf comment. Sitting next to her, wearing a vest with Friends of Coal logo, Jack Laxo underscored the empathy that Trump seemed to offer while the Democrats insulted them. Looking straight at the video camera, he said, "We went from a downtime last year where we had a president and a presidential candidate who said they were going to shut down coal mining to having a candidate that says, 'Hey, I'm here with you. I'm here for you. We're going to do something.'" Trump seemed to offer an empathetic hand, and the election provided people hope. Jack continued saying, "You saw right after the election, you'd walk downtown and you'd see people with smiles on their faces. They finally felt like the albatross was gone and there's been 200 pounds lifted from their shoulders." What was appealing to them about Trump wasn't primarily his anger, but the empathy that he seemed to offer. This was especially potent given the broader national discourse that reduced them to caricature. And with that, I will say thank you.